It says it's live. Let's hope it's live, because without Howie and Paula with their backup recorder, we'll have to see whether now we'll test whether it fails because we don't have the backup. So, time to get down to business, which was going to be especially interesting because we're coming off of a rather momentous event. That is to say, there was a general election in Israel yesterday. Yes, hopefully everybody was paying attention to that. Good, because we are going to discuss some of the results, but we're going to discuss more of the results of the results. That is to say, how we react to the results, rather than just talking about the political landscape itself, since we're going to have to wait and see how that landscape unfolds. But I wanted to give just a little bit of a nod to Parashat Vayikra as we start, because it would be a shame not to at least mention something from the parasha before we get down to our current business. So we're actually going to look at a section on page 597. Please do not read anything political into this statement. It is meant to be a launching point, and it's a good launching point no matter who you would have voted for if you were going to vote, or if you are in Israel or an Israeli citizen who you did vote for. It is not meant as a judgment. It is simply meant as a launching point, hopefully, as will be seen by the other commentaries that come.
Verse 13.
Verse 13. How'd you guess?
Yes.
Yes. Like I said, this is not meant, please, as a judgment about the outcome of the election. And it would have been entirely appropriate no matter who was chosen as the plurality, as the largest single party, to then lead up a coalition. And the fact is that, as everybody can laugh and joke and groan about that verse and how much it might apply, depending upon your own political persuasion, the fact is this is not the first, nor will it be the last election when a majority of the people didn't like the outcome. Democracy, I know we might think that a majority of the people like the outcome, but that's very rarely the case. In Israel, it's much starker because no single party has a majority. Even the largest party only got 30 seats from the Knesset out of 120. So that's not exactly what you would call a resounding mandate from the masses of support. And even within America, given the fact that you have a limited number of people who are eligible to vote, and then a limited number of people who actually turn out to vote, in the end, there is never anything like a majority of even U.S. citizens, let alone people who are also living here legally, that are in favor of who actually is put into power. So it's rare that you get a majority who are behind the elected officials. With that being said, let's take a look then at how our community has talked about the disappointment that may or may not occur at different times. So we're on page 597. This is Leviticus chapter 4 and verse 13. And Harriet, I see you already getting ready to read.
Ready? If it is the whole community of Israel that has erred, and the matter escapes the notice of the congregation, so that they do any of the things which by the Lord's commandments ought not to be done, and they realize their guilt.
All right, going to pause. Let's make sure we understand what we're talking about in the Torah before we start applying it to anything else. What's the situation here?
They're sacrificing a bull.
Well, we're going to be sacrificing, but why is this sacrifice coming? What's it coming on behalf of? Right, this is not a holiday sacrifice. This is not a daily sacrifice. This is a collective guilt. Okay, but one
that they weren't even aware of at the time.
Okay.
It says if the anointed priest has incurred the guilt, the blame falls on the people.
Well, so that's back in verse 3. There's what happens if it is the Kohen that does something wrong, and here we're talking about what happens if it is the entire community that does something wrong by mistake. Right? This is not a question of the entire community has rebelled and is deliberately saying, you can go to wherever, God, we're going to do this, that, and the other, even though we know it's a violation of the commandment, even though we know that you've told us not to, and da-da-da-da-da. This is, today's Saturday? Oh, but all of the calendars that were printed by the local funeral home said that today was Sunday. I didn't realize today was Saturday. And they then realize that all of a sudden they've been doing something wrong. You might wonder how in the world could this possibly happen. That entire community would imagine that they were doing something right, but in fact it turned out to be wrong. it's quite easy to happen. And traveling is one of the easiest ways for that to happen. You have an entire group of people who are on a boat, they travel to a new country, they get off in the new country, there are no Jews there. They ask, well, what day is it locally? Because, we've been at sea for a month and a half, and they get the wrong idea. And then they find out later that it was all wrong. And now they've got to, we made a horrible mistake. We did things on Shabbos when we shouldn't have done them. We didn't celebrate holidays when we should have celebrated them. And you got a problem. How do you respond? Do you just say, oops, or do you do something? And the answer is do something, exactly. And when we had a temple in Jerusalem or a Mishkan in the wilderness, this is the something we would do. Onward.
When the sin through which they incurred guilt becomes known,
that's the moment.
The congregation shall offer a bull of the herd as a purification offering and bring it before the tent of meeting.
All right, so thing to note, the entire community has done something wrong. When the entire community recognizes it, you might have thought that every member of the community, having participated in the transgression, would be responsible for bringing their own sacrifice, right? If an individual makes a mistake by accident, the individual is responsible for bringing a sacrifice. But here we have a collection of individuals making a collective series of mistakes, and yet there's only one sacrifice, because this wasn't a mistake of individuals, this was a mistake of the group. And therefore one sacrifice is sufficient.
The elders of the community shall lay their hands upon the head of the bull before the Lord, and the bull shall be slaughtered before the Lord.
Right, so in general, when there's a sacrifice for an inadvertent sin, the person who committed the inadvertent sin puts their hands on the sacrifice and declares their guilt, and therefore the offering is done in expiation for their transgression. Well, obviously you can't get everybody in the community all to touch the same cow. It just, physically doesn't work. So you have the elders of the people, you have the leaders of the community as representatives who are declaring the guilt of the community on this cow on behalf of the entire community. We're doing okay here so far? Okay.
The Kohen shall bring some of the blood of the bull into the tent of meeting, and the Kohen shall dip his finger in the blood and sprinkle it 7 times before the Lord in front of the curtain. Some of the blood he shall put on the horns of the altar, which is before the Lord in the tent of meeting, and all the rest of the blood he shall pour out at the base of the altar of burnt offering, which is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. He shall remove all its fat from it and turn it into smoke on the altar. He shall do this with the bull, just as is done with the priest's bull of purification offering. He shall do the same with it. Thus the priest shall make expiation for them, and they shall be forgiven. He shall carry the bull outside the camp and burn it as he burned the first bull. It is the purification offering of the congregation.
Okay, so if the whole community has been involved in making a mistake, and it's not attributable to any one person, the next paragraph details if it's the chieftain or one of the main chiefs that does one of these problems, or if it was if it was the priest, then that was detailed in the paragraph before. But if this was just a collective boo-boo, then there is a collective offering that is done for that transgression. But how do you know when you've done something wrong if everybody was doing it? I mean, recognize the difficulty of spotting the error here. All right, what's the speed limit on the freeway?
65.
Right. Let's say on average, right, in most of these areas, the speed limit might be 65 on average. Right. What's the average speed?
75.
Somewhere between, let's be generous and say 70 at a low end and maybe 80. We probably could push those up by 5 miles an hour.
There's an interesting video a couple of years ago that a group of college kids in Atlanta did, because the beltway around Atlanta is at 55, and it's like an 8 to 12 lane highway, and it's 55. So they got out in their cars and they went 55 in a row across all lanes of traffic.
Oh my God.
And how much trouble did they cause?
Tremendous backup. Right?
But they were going the speed limit.
Yes.
As a bar.
As a bar.
What a very
And in front of them was emptiness.
Emptiness, yes.
And behind them,
Yes.
They're going to get whacked.
they're going to get, no, they can't get lapped. No one's going to get by.
Get by. Oh, that's.
All right, so but if I'm driving, my little car here, and I'm
Nice car.
Thank you. And I'm driving 75 miles an hour. Have I done anything wrong?
Sure.
I've done something wrong, right? But everyone is driving this speed. If I were to go 55 miles an hour, or 65, let's say, right? And I started with a megaphone, going, "You're all going too fast. You're all going too fast," while they were whizzing past me when I was going 65. Would that be a welcome reminder from everyone else?
David and I were
You might get shot.
Actually, David and I were in that situation not that long ago where he was doing the 75 and everybody else was. And we talked about it.
Mhm.
And had he slowed down, he would have been a danger to everybody else as they tried to scoot around. We would have caused more accident. So we just, closed our eyes and kept up the speed limit.
Well, closing your eyes, I'm not going to recommend. Somebody just closed their eyes and put our foot down on the gas, and everything was
But
okay.
everybody else.
Yeah, but not recommended driving technique. So if you know that it should be 65, but the community is doing 70 to 80, there is a little bit of a trouble trying to communicate that idea. And if there isn't a sign posted, but you think 75 is too fast, is it even harder to tell everyone else to slow down? Right, at least when there's a posted sign, then you've got the law on your side. But if there's no posted sign, it becomes more difficult. Or what happens if there's one sign that says 65, and then just a little ways away, there's another sign that says 75. And you think the sign that said 75 was a mistake. Any chance they're going to convince the 75 mile an hours that they're just, no? And what happens when you engage them in conversation?
Yeah.
Right.
Not working? It's you're all laughing and scoffing, but this is the nature of Jewish discussion. Precisely this is that one group will say, "I see the sign and it says 65," and another group will say, "I see the sign that says 75." And you're telling me that they can't have a conversation without fists and guns and broken windows and ramming cars and
Well,
other.
they're going to have a discussion while they're actually driving.
Well, they might have a discussion while they're driving, but it'll be with someone else on the phone while they're texting, which is another issue. And when we come to the discussion of the election that happened in Israel, when people are making a decision of who to vote for, it's very much like this. That is to say, everybody who goes into that polling place has to decide what speed they think things should be moving at in any different sphere of life. And once they've decided, they put their piece of paper and say, "I think the speed limit should be da-da-da-da-da," and then it comes out, and then we deal with the results of that discussion. Anybody here think it would be a good idea to vote for the speed limit on the freeway?
Have you ever seen
But you do realize you do that, right?
Yes.
When you elected people who are in charge of the freeways, you are voting for the speed limit because you voted for the people who made those decisions.
I understand the basic premise of the Israeli Knesset.
Okay.
Have you ever seen a ballot?
Yes.
What does it look like? I mean, is it you just check one thing and done?
No. It's would you like to explain?
Well, I haven't seen the ballot, but I understand that each party is represented by one or two letters.
Right.
And then you mark that down on your piece of paper, what party you want. And
But
then
you only vote for one part.
correct.
Exactly.
That's it.
Exactly right.
So you just one vote for
One
every-
vote.
Right. So you pick up the little piece of paper that has the symbol, the label, like it would be, maybe say like GOP if it was Republicans in America, and it says GOP, and you walk over to the box and you put that in the box.
And you're finished voting.
Yep.
So there's no issues, there's no referenda, there's no.
Not for the general election or like that, no.
Okay.
Right.
It's
And you just count up the total number of votes all throughout the nation, and then you divide up the seats based upon the percentage of votes that went. Once you've taken care of all those people who fell below the threshold that didn't get enough votes to even reach that minimum.
No lines.
No lines. Oh, I'm sure some people probably still take their time. And there are issues. There's issues of voter fraud and issues of questions of whether or not there were properly stocked polling places where we just didn't have any of those slips of paper for those parties at our booths. So they have those issues as well in every election. But yeah, that's the general idea. So you get the right piece of paper to match the party that you're voting for, who have declared who their prime minister would be if they are asked to form the coalition. So you're not voting for a person, you're just voting for the party. And indirectly voting for a person, and then you drop it in, and then if they get 30 seats, the top 30 people on their list will have a seat in the Knesset. And number 31 says, if only we got one more percent. And if they get 25 seats, then the top 25 people on their lists will sit in Knesset.
How do you know how many seats? It's based on proportion.
Well, there are 120 seats in the Knesset, and then you divide it up based upon the proportion of votes that have been cast. Like I said, once you take care of the fiddly percentages of the tiny parties that didn't actually win any seats.
You have to get at least 3.5%
Right.
of the vote in order to be eligible for it.
For even one seat, exactly.
And it's all paper.
What's that? Yes.
It's all paper, no electronic box.
I have not. I've only heard of paper, and I've all the photos I've seen recently are still paper as well. So yeah,
They probably scan from like we do here.
I'm sure they do both electronic as well as hand counting.
Right, because they have the answers. I mean.
Yeah,
by
no
6
hanging,
a.m. the
no
next
hanging
day.
chads,
Yeah.
no hanging
No
chads.
hanging-
By 6 a.m. And the polls are open till 10.
Yes, and so you have in front of you the results in lovely color graph. So the end of the election that we got, so the one we had just yesterday, ended up with Likud having 30 seats in the Knesset, with the Zionist Union, which was Herzog and Tzipi Livni's pre-election coalition. Technically separate parties, but they were already agreed upon what they would do jointly should they be asked to form the basis of the government. They received 24 points. That was a little bit of an upset based on polling data, which is, take it for what it's worth. Because in the polling data, the Zionist Union was leading Likud going into yesterday's election. The joint list, which has Hadash as well as the Arab parties collectively having one list of candidates, is the third largest party that went into this election or came out of this election with 14 seats. Yesh Atid, which is a very centrist party, came away with 11. Kulanu, which was a breakaway party from Likud, so it's center right, came out with 10 seats. Habayit Yehudi, which is the often called a party of the settlers, but it's the Zionist Orthodox driven party list mostly.
That's Bennett, isn't it?
What? That's Bennett. Thank you. Yes, Naftali Bennett. Came out with 8. Shas, which is a Sephardic ultra-Orthodox group, came out with 7. United Torah Judaism, which is a Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox group, mostly Ashkenazi, came out with 6. Israel Beitenu, which is Lieberman, which had a huge Russian following, came out with 6. And Meretz, which is a far-left party, came out with 4. And everyone else didn't get enough votes to even get a seat.
Because there were many more parties.
Because there were many more parties. There were many more parties than this, but they didn't get enough to get a seat. And so Likud, because it had the largest single block, is then asked by the president to form a government. Now, as you can see, it doesn't have a majority, so that means it has to form a coalition. It has to ask other parties to work with it in order to form at least 61 seats, and then they can govern until either someone pulls out of the coalition or until 5 years elapse and then they have to call another election. Everyone up to date on how the politics works here? So Likud has said that they will be forming a coalition with Kulanu, Habayit Yehudi, Shas, United Torah Judaism, and Israel Beitenu.
That would give them how many?
I think that's 67 or something. I think it's 67 seats. What's that?
Would you say those again?
Well, take Likud on the left, take Meretz, and then scratch Meretz on the right, and then take from Kulanu all the way down. So it's Likud has this big pillar, and then you have three centrist parties, the Zionist Union, the Hadash, the Arab parties, although what they call the Arab parties, the centrist party or not is a little controversial, and Yesh Atid, they get skipped because they will not serve with Likud in the coalition, and then Kulanu all the way down, except for Meretz, which was definitely not going to serve with Likud ever. That would be a rather odd occurrence. Does that make sense? What's that? Sure, it sounds right. I think it came out to be a total of 67 seats for their coalition. Maybe my math is wrong. I apologize. I've said many times I'm not an accountant.
Well, David came up with 67 also, so you must.
Yay, maybe I'm
He
okay.
said so, you're right.
Okay. If you said so, then I'll take it as gospel.
Yes.
Now, if you do the math, and if there was a possibility that the joint list, that is to say Hadash, which is a Jewish party, plus the Arab lists, would have worked in a coalition with the Zionist Union, with Yesh Atid, and with Meretz, they could have also, if they had convinced Kulanu to join, have formed a coalition. So there is the potential for two different coalitions on this piece of paper that each would have had more than 60 votes, 60 seats in the Knesset. Which means, how do we know what the will of the people was? Right? Because people will often say, you need to support Israel, you need to support Israel's government, and da-da-da-da-da. But really what we talk about is we want to support Israel, we want to support the people of Israel. How do we do that? How do we reconcile this controversy, which the Israelis themselves were fighting tooth and nail for just until the polls closed at 10 o'clock, and probably will still be fighting a little bit more to finish up the margins of what the new policies will be, of who's going to get what seats in the coalition and what portfolios in the government and what perks and policy implementations as they want. How do we then move past this controversy? What do we do? Well, you may be surprised to know this is not the first controversy in Jewish history. Yeah. We're kind of an expert with controversies. So we're going to look at some of the discussion of how Judaism has talked about these controversies, some of the examples of them, and what we are supposed to do when we are faced with intractable or seemingly intractable disagreements. Because whatever happens here, Israel needs to move. They need to move past the election, and they need to govern, and they need to implement policies that will be for the betterment of the nation. And that can only happen if the election is done and then the policy implementation goes on. Make sense? All right, so let's see what we've done in the past.
Any controversy which is for the sake of heaven will result in something permanent. But when it is not for the sake of heaven, it will have no permanence.
All right, so a machloket, a controversy, that is l'shem shamayim, that is for the name of heaven, for the sake of heaven. That is considered to endure. And by endure, they don't mean it's going to go on forever and ever and ever. They mean that the benefit of the controversy will be lasting. So what do you notice, first of all, about the idea here in Judaism? Controversy, a good or bad thing?
Depends.
Yeah.
Depends, which means it can potentially be
Good.
a very good thing. Right? We're not saying having a machloket, having a controversy is bad. We're saying some controversies help and are enduring in the sense that they build our people, and some other controversies not so enduring in the sense that they are not helpful to our nation. And that is the second. We're going to give an example first. Sorry.
Which controversy was one that was for the sake of heaven? The controversy between Hillel and Shammai.
And we're going to get into that in more detail, so just hold on.
Which controversy was not for the sake of heaven? The controversy of Korach and his company.
All right, so everybody remembers the story of Korach during the wilderness day. They came and they challenged Moses and Aaron, well, Aaron more than Moses even, and in the end, earth opens up and they get swallowed up by the earth, right? And that was an argument. Hillel and Shammai are an argument. Why should one be good and the other be bad? Right? Why should Hillel and Shammai be considered the model of a good argument, and why should Korach be a bad argument? I mean, aren't you allowed to argue? And if some arguments are good and some arguments are bad, how do you tell the difference, and how can you say some are evil?
Well, if I remember correctly, maybe Korach, he was challenging God's choice Moses and Aaron. He
Mhm.
was challenged. Whereas with Hillel and Shammai, they were trying to figure out exactly what God meant about the commandments. So if you bring out that disagreement and have more talking points, you may be able to come to a conclusion better, but you don't challenge God and say, why'd you give us that commandment? Or why'd you pick those guys?
We can certainly interpret it that way.
Yes.
That Korach was challenging God's decision, which was explicit. But I would believe that Korach would argue the sign wasn't so clear.
Oh.
That Moses and Aaron had assumed too much. And they were interpreting God's appointment of them to the position of leader and Kohen Gadol beyond the limit that it should have been. And he says explicitly, you've taken too much. And therefore, we should all get more. Well, Korach is a complicated guy.
Yeah.
At least that's how he would have argued.
Well, Hillel and Shammai's controversy was looking at the benefits for the community and how the community was to function and what was the better things that could be in the community. And Korach was much more for himself. Was a much more, I deserve this power. There's more power as opposed to community.
So if an argument is for the sake of my own aggrandizement or my own power or my own position or my own status, because I don't like saying I'm wrong, then that's not L'Shem Shammai. That would be a Korach argument. But if an argument is for the good of the community and focused on what should we be doing, what's best for us, then even if I'm arguing in your face, I'm still L'Shem Shammai. It's still a worthy discussion. So if we were to put that back into our speed limit argument, if one guy said, well, I think 65 should be the speed limit because it's safer that way, and another person says, well, I think 75 should be the speed limit because I'll get to work sooner, we can see a difference in the moral underpinnings, perhaps.
Right, so if you can have that, I think 65 is better because it's safer, and the guy that's saying 75 says, oh, but the cars now have more advances,
Exactly.
so they would, they won't hit each other,
That would
so
be,
you would have the same argument
right.
as to what's safe.
That would be an equal rebuttal. Exactly. And you could argue, well, actually, I think 75 is safer because if I go 65, people are going to run me over. Or you can argue that the cars are safer now, or just that in general, the roads are built better than they used to be. And so you can ride at 75 with the same degree of control and surety. Or you can argue, well, if you want to be safe, then the speed limit should be 40. And you can argue the other direction. So,
Right.
But all of that would be arguing about what's best for the community, not just what do I want for me. And that might make it a little bit more enduring. Well, let's see if that plays out with regards to the style of arguing that Shammai and Hillel actually get into.
So, and these are some of the regulations enacted in the attic of Hananiah ben Hezekiah ben Gorion when the rabbis came to visit him. They did a roll call.
You all know about this, right? Like, what in the world are we talking about? Why are they having a meeting in an attic? What's going on here? Well, keep reading.
They did a roll call and found that the disciples of Shammai were more numerous than those of Hillel, and they enforced 18 regulations on that day.
Okay, so Mishnah Shabbat, they have a special meeting in the usual place, which is some guy's attic, which is odd. And in the process of doing a roll call, lo and behold, on this day, at this time, there were more people from Shammai than from the school of Hillel. And so when they took the vote, guess who won?
Yeah.
Right? Which is unusual. For those of you that are familiar with the typical halachic debates, Shammai almost always loses. That is to say, Beit Shammai, the house of Shammai, the disciples of Shammai, the teacher, usually come out on the bottom of the arguments with their adversaries from Beit Hillel. And if you want to think of these as political parties, that's not a bad idea. But in this moment, there was a special election, and it happened to be in an attic. And it happened that at the end of this voting session, that there were more Shammites than Hillites, and therefore they were able to pass through 18 pieces of legislation that otherwise, if the numbers had been reversed, would never have been enacted. Right? All fair and perfect, yes? Well, except we get more detail.
Beit Shammai thrust a sword into the study house and declared, "Whoever wants to enter may enter, but no one may leave." And on that day, Hillel sat in submission before Shammai, like one of the disciples. And it was as wretched for Israel as the day on which the calf was made.
Which cow is this?
Yeah.
Which
That
the golden calf. Exactly right. So in the Talmud, we get a little more detail, and don't turn the page, because we get more detail on the next page. But in the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, we get a little more detail that this wasn't just, it happened that more people showed up for the vote from Shammai than Hillel this day. There was a sword put into the midst of the conversation. And basically it was like, well, you know, if you want to come and vote, you can.
Yeah.
But there's no guarantee you're going home if you come in. As he sits there. Because, you know, accidents can happen when you're voting. You might get a very serious paper cut from the ballot. And
Right.
if it just so happened to take your head off, well, you know, I just got to let you know that these are the risks. So it seems to be that from this text, how did Shammai make sure that they had more people voting on their side? Coercion, sword, intimidation, right? That they essentially intimidated the people from Beit Hillel into not being in large enough number to outnumber them, even though they were a larger constituency within the Jewish people. But the vote was the vote, and the legislation went through. So what do we take then from this? Don't turn it over. So what do we take it then? I'm looking out the corner of my eye. So what do we take it then with this final phrase? If this was as hard for us as the day of the golden calf.
Well, the golden calf was again, you know, the population doing something all together, you know, and doesn't make it right with what they did. And, you know, the mass, even though Shammai had the numbers, what he was doing was not kosher.
So we had a sort of mob mentality at the golden calf time, and therefore this seems to be also driving in a similar threat of violence. Yes?
I thought he was referring to the nature of the legislation which had been passed, that the legislation was as bad for Israel as the...
Or perhaps then, maybe it was the 18 pieces of legislation that got passed were as improper as the golden calf itself was. Except the 18 pieces stand. They don't get revoked by the people. So I'm not entirely sure that they're rejecting that. But the day of the golden...
18 pieces were?
Yeah, there's a list.
Oh.
The golden calf, what happened when Moses came down?
He broke the tablets.
He broke the tablets, and
And a bunch of people got killed.
a bunch of people got killed. How did they get killed?
They ground up the
By the sword.
Yeah.
They went through slaughtering the people that were on the wrong side. They went through slaughtering the ringleaders. Turn the page.
It was taught in the name of Rabbi Yehoshua Oniah. The students of Beit Shammai stood below them, and they began to slaughter the students of Beit Hillel. It was taught, 6 of them ascended, and the others stood over them with swords and lances.
All right. So in the Rishomi, you get a little more detail of what's going on here. And now, rather than simply having coercion, rather than just having the sword on the table between you, what's happening? Yeah, it's down to actual violence between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. And basically, Beit Shammai said, we are going to kill you until you capitulate to our demands. And we will have a vote, but you only get to go up the ladder to the attic to vote if we let you. And we'll let a number go up so that there's a fair representation. And anyone else who tries to go up gets killed. And there is a tradition that 3,000 students of Beit Hillel were killed on this day, which would be very appropriate in connection to the 3,000 dead of the golden calf. Right? 3,000 people were killed from the golden calf. 3,000 students killed from Hillel. We get an interesting parallel. But hold on a second. Doesn't sit right, does it?
No,
Doesn't
not
feel,
at all.
Why not?
Well, for one thing, I've got a commandment that says you shouldn't kill. And these
Okay.
people are discussing the important things that God has commanded us, and they've ignored this one?
But they killed the people who made the calf.
Like,
But
the calf wasn't commanded.
the calf wasn't commanded, no. And they kind of deserved it.
Right,
Right.
well, not that they deserved it, but
You mean the people who got killed for the golden calf didn't deserve to be killed?
no, they were scared. Moses hadn't come back yet. It's a long time. We're in the middle of the desert here. There's nothing
So you're
around
saying,
us.
so you're saying Moses and the Levites murdered the people who made the golden calf. They shouldn't have killed them.
I'm sorry, I come down on that side. That's correct. They shouldn't have killed them. It was
Well-
an honest mistake.
Okay. Well, it was an honest mistake. We can argue about it, the honesty of the mistake, but we can definitely agree that it was a mistake.
Yes.
And the question would be, when our tradition says that this Attic slaughter that was taking place is as hard for Israel as the day of the golden calf. And both of those were essentially arguments, right? You had the side of Moses who said, we can't have the calf, the people who did this must be killed. Here you have the side of Shammai who says, we can't have what Hillel is proposing. They must be killed if they don't capitulate. But on one side, we know they were definitely wrong for making the golden calf.
Mhm.
On the other hand, well, Shammai knew that Hillel was definitely wrong for the way they interpreted the law, right? I mean, wasn't that the nature of their argument? I mean, Shammai knew that Hillel was wrong. That's why they were arguing, right? It's like the old joke says, I'd agree with you if you were right, right? The only reason I'm arguing is because you're wrong. And if you're wrong about something so important as this, that it undermines all of Judaism, then shouldn't I be like Moses and the Levites and defend God? You know, all that are for God rally to me and go tent by tent and kill those that are on the wrong side. Don't you have to defend sometimes to the sword? Even brother against brother and father against child? That's what happened with the golden calf.
No,
Not so much?
no.
Well, so hold on. So it's okay. We'll come back to the phrase that was used at the end of the Talmud, at the end of the Talmud in 17a, right? And it was as wretched for Israel as the day on which the calf was made. So it's easy to read that line as saying this was as bad as the making of the golden calf, but you can also read it as saying this was as bad as the aftermath of the golden calf. Because the worst part of the making of the golden calf wasn't the making of the golden calf. The worst part of the golden calf was the fact that 3,000 people lost their lives. That is the worst part. The calf is a very bad thing. I mean, and I'm not trying to say that was no problem. Obviously, the making of the calf was a huge problem theologically, spiritually, and historically for our people. But the slaughter of 3,000 was as bad. Because after all, we just read in Vayikra, there's supposed to be a way when you've made a mistake to fix it. Even when it's a whole community's mistake. Even when, someone shows up like Moses and says, what are you doing? You're supposed to be able to find a way when they have all collectively done something wrong to fix it. Short of death. And that's not the way we're supposed to settle arguments. We're not supposed to use the sword to fix the problem. Any more than Shammai did when he was stacking the deck, or Beit Shammai was doing when he was stacking the deck for the voting on the regulations.
Going back to the calf,
Mhm.
and was it, obviously Moses would have been upset, but, but these people actually built an idol.
Mhm.
And that was totally wrong. And so I guess, was it God who said to Moses, now you need to kill these people?
Well, God threatened.
Because,
God, God threatened to wipe out all the people. And Moses talked him out of it when he was up on the mountain. But when Moses got down to the foot of the mountain and saw it with his own eyes, all of a sudden the sword came out. So there is a question of whether or not God was trying to show to Moses, you talked me out of my anger, you should not go ballistic as well. And then Moses did kind of lose it and ended with slaughter. Or perhaps at that point, at that time, it was necessary, but we still should not celebrate that it was necessary at that time, and we certainly shouldn't repeat that activity for the settling of disputes in later times. And it's important to remember that when the golden calf was made, it was not 100% rejection of God. Right? Because when they made the cow, they said, this is God. They didn't say this is some Egyptian god, this is some Canaanite god, this is some new god we're making up. They said this is the God who led us out of Egypt. So they were wrong for making an idol, but they weren't worshiping a different God. They were worshiping the right God in the wrong way. And really that's what the speed limit sign thing is all about. Right? Sometimes we know and we agree that we need to serve God, but we got a different opinion on exactly what that sign says of how fast we should be going. They thought it was said 450 miles an hour, no problem, idle's okay. And obviously, with a little bit of thought, they would have recognized, no, idols are not okay. But at least they were aiming the right direction, just using entirely the wrong method.
And how much did they know of what was the right way when Moses hadn't even come down with the 10 Commandments yet?
Well, generally speaking, in the usual reading of the chronology of the text, and I think you were you were in Israel when we were discussing this in the sanctuary a couple weeks ago when we were reading Kitisa. The usual chronology that most commentators use is that the 10 Commandments were given verbally before Moses went up the mountain. And so the people had been told not to make graven images. And it was only when Moses came down with the written commandments that he saw the golden calf. So they would have heard the prohibition. Maybe they didn't fully understand it. Certainly they didn't have a written copy by that point. But generally speaking, most commentators say they had been prohibited from making idols. But they've been prohibited from doing lots of things. And if the sword came out every time someone did something, either that was a bad interpretation or just wrong, we wouldn't need the book of Vayikra. Right? Because this whole discussion of what to do when you've done something wrong and what sacrifices to bring and how you make atonement wouldn't matter. Because if you did something wrong, you'd be dead. And you don't need to make atonement if you're dead. So the whole notion of Vayikra is that you can fix a problem in a way other than a sword. Or rather, the sword is only going to go to the animal's throat rather than your own.
Weren't there different levels of punishment depending on what your involvement was too? Not everyone.
Yes. So even though the vast majority of the camp was involved in the golden calf, only 3,000 people, in quotes, only 3,000 were killed. So it could be argued that was restraint. But let's see if we can't find a better way to argue.
Does Aaron get punished? I'm going back to look.
Does Aaron get punished? Not directly. He goes on to be the high priest. He goes on to have his lineage be involved. You can argue that it was punishment that he and his family received no inheritance in the land of Israel. They did not receive land. They were forced into essentially servitude of the nation. You may argue that they got choice cuts, and that's not a bad servitude, but it was still servitude, and their descendants to this day still have limitations on things they can and can't do, and still have obligations to the community that they are meant to live up to. But he is not one of the ones killed by the onslaught.
And I'm going back and looking at the text, and it's the text is pretty explicit. I mean, this last line. For what they did with the calf that Aaron made.
Yes. Yeah, there's little doubt of his involvement.
Yeah.
He lost his 2 sons.
And it can be argued that Nadav and Avihu died because of this, although there are other arguments that they died for their own transgressions. Certainly he ends up being buried in the wilderness rather than getting into the land of Israel, which can also be argued as being attributable to this. So he doesn't get by without criticism, but he is not punished the same way. You're right. All right, but we got to move on because you've only got 10 more minutes, ish.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I know. I'm always strict on time.
With all these words, Moses attempted to appease Korach, and you do not find that he responded in any way.
Right. So if you go to Parashat Korach and you read through the whole discussion, Korach comes and lays out his demands before Moses and Aaron, and Moses responds, and Korach does not rebut. He just continues to hound the people with his complaints. He doesn't actually engage in a dialogue with Moses. And so from this, the Midrash says,
This is because he was prudent in his wickedness.
yeah, nothing worse than a clever, wicked person.
He said, if I respond to him, I know that he is exceptionally wise, and he will hereupon overwhelm me with his words. It is best that I do not engage him.
All right, so one of the differences between Hillel and Shammai and the arguments of Korach, is Korach wouldn't engage in the conversation. He wasn't going to debate with you. He was right, and therefore there was no point talking to you because he knew that if he actually talked with you, he'd lose. Right? That it would be clear once engaged in a proper discussion or debate that his side lacked merit, that it did not have the support either of text or of facts or of anything else with it. Which is very clear when you read through the Torah portion of Korach. Moses says, show me where I've done too much. Show me what we've done that has been improper. And there is no response, because obviously there can be no response, but rather than join in the conversation and then be shown to have no response, Korach simply continues his rabble-rousing without engaging, which is another good sign that someone is engaged in a debate that is not l'shem shamayim, right? That is not for the sake of heaven. If you're not willing to actually talk to the people whom you are criticizing or disagreeing with, then chances are it's because you know you have no answer to their criticisms. And therefore, that really weakens your position. Okay, onward.
If it is the fact that these and those,
Which is a famous phrase from the Talmud regarding the teachings of Beit Hillel and the teachings of Beit Shammai.
if these and those both represent the words of the living God, how come the house of Hillel enjoyed the unearned grace of having the law decided in accord with their position?
Right, so in Eruvin, you have a very famous section where the Hillel and Shammai, Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai are arguing over and over and over again, causing lots of strife. And finally, a voice from heaven says, both of these words are the words of the living God. But the law goes with Beit Hillel. And the Talmud asks itself, well, wait a minute. If these are both God's words, even though they're opposing each other, how come one side gets to win rather than the other side? And there's the answer.
Because the house of Hillel, they are gentle and diffident. They repeated their opinion and also the opinion of the house of Shammai. And not only so, but they gave priority to the teachings of the house of Shammai over their own teaching.
Makes sense? So why should Hillel be given priority in terms of who's going to have the law follow them?
Because they really listened to both sides and thought about it. And they really heard it. Whereas the implication is Shammai was only listening to themselves and they don't hear the opposite side anyway, so they're not really making a good decision.
The implication is that Shammai transmitted Beit Shammai teachings to Beit Shammai students, who transmitted it to the next generation, to the next generation, the next generation. And when they debated, they would present their opinions. Whereas Hillel transmitted both and explained why they preferred their own over that of Shammai. And they did so in a way that was not antagonistic, it was not insulting, it was not abusive, and it certainly didn't involve any of the demagoguery or straw man arguments that you see often in politics. It was simply, this is what they say. And they explained it legitimately and clearly, and then they explained why they thought it was wrong and why they thought their interpretation was better. And that was enough, according to the Talmud, for heaven to say, even though both of these could be valid opinions for Israel, we're taking Beit Hillel's. That's a major stamp of approval for how you're meant to engage in a discussion. If you are seeking an argument for the sake of heaven, the Shem Shemaim, then you need to treat your opponents in a way that is proper, that is recognizing within them that they are created in God's image and that they also are engaged in a worthy act of supporting heaven by argumentation. And you can't do that by slandering them or maligning them or misrepresenting their opinions. Kathy, you're shaking over there.
Well, I just, I understand all this, and I just don't know how the Haredim reconcile their study with their actions over and over again.
You mean when they say they can't leave the Beit HaMidrash to serve in the military because it would be breaking the shield of protection that their study provides? How do they reconcile with going to mass protests and rallies for the politics? If they believe that God is defending them by their studies from missiles, why can't God defend them from elections because of their study?
Or even, we can totally disrespect your opinion because it's not ours.
So to present their argument in the best possible light, trying to learn from Beit Hillel. Their
They
position.
seem to learn from Beit Shammai.
Well, to be fair, but before I put it in their best possible light, let me give you an analogy. Imagine we are having a community-wide discussion, among the Jewish community, about the situation in Israel, and the Federation receives a request from the Chabad rabbis, the conservative rabbis, and the Reform rabbis, and the Jews from Jesus, to allow representatives to be on this panel discussion. Is the Federation going to honor the request of the Jews for Jesus to be on part of the panel discussion for Judaism? No. Why not?
Because of the Jesus.
Because of the Jesus part.
Yeah, right.
Because the opinions of that group are considered by the rest of Judaism to be outside the boundaries of acceptable Jewish positions. The Haredim, in their opinion, and like I said, I don't agree with it, but this is their opinion, see the opinion of, to be honest, an increasingly smaller or increasingly larger and larger circle of the Jewish world as being invalid from the beginning and therefore not worth listening to or discussing. Obviously, I disagree, and it's a very demonstrable trend that they are listening to a smaller and smaller circle only, more and more exclusively, and with less and less debate being involved even within their own communities in matters of policy as opposed to matters of just study. But in their opinion, all of the other opinions are simply not worthy. I would argue with you if you had the chance to be right. But since you don't have the chance to be right, therefore I don't even have to waste my time because there's no way you could be right. Because look at where you started from. Obviously I disagree, but that is how they reconcile it for themselves, and why amongst the few that they are willing to agree to disagree with, they do have discussions and debates. So among some of the Haredi that are Sephardi and the Haredi that are Ashkenazi, they will argue about whether or not you should be having kitniot, legumes and such, during Passover. But they're not going to argue that with me.
We're talking about strictly religious things, right? But if we do not allow the Jews for Jesus, why do we allow the Arabs?
Why do we allow them to vote? Well, Israel does allow Jews for Jesus who live in Israel to vote. Absolutely, Israel does. I'm talking about in terms of purely Jewish discussions. We have a discussion, but with regards to Israel's own politics, Israel is, I think, very proud that it does offer citizenship to all of the people who live within its borders, which is something that cannot be said for any of its neighbors. And that's something that is, I think, an important pillar for Israel's future. Because without that, then it really does begin to blend into the background of the neighborhood. We may disagree with the fact that many of the Arab parties have proponents and policies that are antithetical to both Judaism, Jews, as well as the future of Israel. But there are many people who feel that way about the different political parties in this country. I know many Democrats who think the Republicans are trying to sabotage our future, and I know many Republicans who think the Democrats are trying to sabotage the future as well. But we still have to let them vote. We still need to have the enfranchisement of all people who are properly eligible to vote as citizens of our country, both here as well as in Israel. So we may vehemently disagree, but if they're part of the group, they have to be allowed to participate. And if they're not part of the group, then we would have to come up with a very complicated way of how we're going to deal with them if they're still within the group. Because being part of a group and not in the group is a recipe for disaster, as we've seen time and time again in our own country as well as in others. All right, moving on.
To teach future generations that a person should not cling to his words.
So why does Yediyot continue to recite many of the arguments between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, only to find out at the end that either one or the other was right, or that they both changed their opinions and went with a third opinion? Why? So that we recognize that even Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai sometimes changed their minds. and they sometimes agreed with the rightness of the other person's position. So it wasn't just that a voice from heaven came out and said, Beit Hillel is always right, and everyone said, okay, we'll do it that way. Beit Hillel did win arguments by convincing Beit Shammai sometimes. It wasn't just a question of majority rule. It wasn't just a question if you can stack enough people in the study hall with sword or not, that you're going to get your way. There was actual policy, debate, reconciliation, and sometimes compromise. God be praised.
It is the way of the righteous to enter in a dispute stiffly and end it amicably.
All right, you start a fight because you got a bone to pick. Right? It's not surprising or even necessarily wrong that you would engage with passion, fervor, and maybe even a little bit of an edge when you start arguing with, what do you mean the speed limit should be 95? Are you nuts? But by the time you get to the end of the argument, you better be smiling.
Korach continued the dispute as he began it, in wrath and passion, and therefore clung to Gehenna.
Right, Gehenna is often referred to as like hell, but basically was clinging to that which is farthest from God. Hello?
Hello? Oh, Shammai conducted his dispute in that spirit of calm which should follow on the first burst of passion. It therefore became a quarrel of love and obtained the approval of heaven.
All right, so I know we may have been a little harsh on Shammai with the whole sword and spear thing, although that was only a single incident and was roundly condemned. And they did feel they were arguing over something that was essential to the future of the people. But what the Zohar is trying to tell us here is that there is still a fundamental difference, that Shammai wasn't like Korah. Because yes, he may have had rough edges. He may have used rhetoric that was inappropriate. He may have even brought a sword, and there may have even been violence. But ultimately, even Shammai, the most passionate of forces arguing within the ancient schools of Judaism, found a way to resolve in calmness and peace from their disputes with Beit Hillel. Because remember, up to this point, we have the notion that Hillel is usually winning in terms of the numbers. And Shammai stacks the deck once with or without violence, depending upon how you read the tradition. You would expect the next step to be escalation and retaliation. Right? If Shammai did something that egregious, they should either be out, or they should be punished, or they should be retaliated against. And Lord knows, if it worked once for Shammai, they should be using that technique over and over again until they are stopped, exterminated, or otherwise controlled. But that's not what we see. Beit Shammai doesn't turn in to a self-perpetuating military autocracy. They go back to the normal routine in all other instances. And in fact, we should remind ourselves of what it was like between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai.
Although Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagreed, Beit Shammai did not abstain from marrying women of the families of Beit Hillel, nor did Beit Hillel refrain from marrying those of Beit Shammai.
Right, so they violently perhaps disagreed on things, but that doesn't mean you can't marry my daughter. Or it doesn't mean that, my daughter can't marry your son. They still allowed for the community to be connected to one another. They did not dissolve into rival tribal camps, which is why this can be so misleading, right? When you look at the chart, you've got these Jews and these Jews and these Jews and Arabs and these and these and these and these, and they're strong pillars, and I use the colors deliberately, right? Completely distinct from one another, and they each have their own agenda, and they are each going to fight, and never will they possibly come together. Well, first of all, we know that in Israel that's not possible. They're going to have to come together at least to form a coalition. But secondly, behind all those numbers are the millions of people who share the country, who live together, and in general, the people who voted in these elections live together in peace, in general. Yes, there are flare-ups between the Haredim and the non-Haredim. There are flare-ups between the Arabs and the non-Arabs, and there are flare-ups between the right and the left. But in general, these people are within one giant community of Klal Yisrael. And if they're not always showing that, that's a problem. But that doesn't mean they can't, and it doesn't mean that that should not be our goal. That should be our goal right now for the next step of Israel's future, is not to continue to belittle, berate, and attack and bemoan all of the things that have happened from this election, but to find a way that this is who we've got now. This is the slate that's going to be the coalition. How do we make this work for all of Israel? Because the government has to serve all of Israel, all of her millions of citizens.
This is to teach you that they showed love and friendship toward one another, thus putting into practice the scriptural text, love, truth, and peace.
From Zechariah. And finish off with one more text.
Even a father and son, rabbi and student, when they are preoccupied in Torah in the same gate, they become enemies of each other. However, they will not move from that spot until they come to love each other.
Think of how beautiful it would be if every time the Knesset was dismissed, everybody went out and had dinner together. Right? Think of what it would be like if after the Knesset was over in session, everybody would get up and shake everybody else's hand and say, look, I am going to fight you tooth and nail in this appropriations bill. I am going to argue until I am blue in the face against you on this issue of Shabbat openings in different cities, or the issue of who should serve or not serve in the military, or how much money should go for this project or not that project. But when we're done, we're still brother and sister and brother and brother and sister, and we are all still part of this wonderful miracle that is Israel. That's what we need to hope, speak for, and pray for the next session of Israel's government, because that is what Israel needs. And if it stays only as clenched fists, which are normal during campaigns, then Israel is going to have a difficult time meeting the challenges that she faces. So pray for peace, those of you who love Jerusalem.
Amen.
And be well.